as though it runs its course after just a dozen of encounters or so. Furthermore, there's
Kulinarne podróże z Bonus Leclerc. Odkryj orientalne specjały z 40% rabatem. Makaron sojowy z fasoli mung 2,85 z kuponem. Jogurty w smakach Azji tylko 5,99 za 8-pak z kuponem.
there's an ability and skill that you can unlock called Final Offer, and this totally breaks the bartering system entirely. Basically, what it allows you to do is get one final offer after the merchant normally would have just completely backed out of the interaction. And that usually happens when you approach with a really aggressive counter offer or initial offer based on the price put forward. So example, if a sword costs 100 coin and then you come back and say, I only want to pay 50. Normally, the merchant would be so insulted at that offer that they would just simply disengage and walk away. But with the final offer ability, they don't get to walk away. So you'll offer 50, they'll be very pissed off, but you get one last chance. And in return, they will say that's ridiculous and they will come back with their best and final offer, which usually is the lowest possible price that they would be willing to part with that item for, at which point you just slide right up, select that price, and you just got the sword for the cheapest possible price by abusing that one mechanic. I mean, again, we can say that players shouldn't do this, but as we mentioned earlier, if players can break a system, if players can use a mechanic and abuse it, they're going to, because the game is holding you to a set standard, and if a tool is available to the player, they're going to use it. In this case, if you give a skill that's centered around bartering and happens to break the bartering system, I don't think it's the player's fault for using that tool. I think it's the developer's fault for not thinking that skill through even just a little bit to polish it to the point where it wouldn't totally break the system. Now, furthermore, I want to discuss navigation because this is what you're going to spend a lot of time doing. There's a lot to talk about here, so let's break it down into the three constituent parts: traversal on foot, traversal on horseback, and generalized exploration. On foot, I think the easiest way to describe the style of exploration in Kingdom Come Deliverance is to say that it suffers from an extreme case of Skyrimitis. This is what I call foot traversal up steep inclines that can be overcome with quick cutbacks and zigzag patterns. You know the type of thing. When you're going up a cliffside in Skyrim, and you really probably shouldn't be able to run up it, but if you zigzag enough, you can kind of spam your way up that hillside and up the rocks and clip up here and jump. It feels cheesy, it's not immersive at all because it looks absolutely ridiculous. And I'm not entirely sure what causes it. Maybe it's a limitation of the game's engine not being able to calculate the proper steepness, if that's a word, of a set level and trying to figure out what the... I don't know if it's that or if it's that navigation just happens to be clunky in this game because the developers didn't smooth out some of those steeper ledges and hillsides, but either way, it ends up looking absolutely ridiculous. And being a first-person perspective game, there were many times when you'll be working your way up a hillside, staring right at the hill because it's at such a steep incline, but you just keep zigzagging up it to get to where you need to go, because it's either you do that or you depart on a detour that will take you all the way around the forest and up around the backside. And I get it, some people might like going up the backside, but sometimes there just isn't enough time in the day and you just got to go in the front door. You know what I'm saying? Just straight line, call it there. Jesus Christ. Was that gag worth it, Luke? I don't think so, but it's too late now. I even if I wanted to get rid of that, the editor's going to keep it in. Jacob wouldn't let me live that down, so it is what it is. Put simply, it just doesn't feel good to play. It looks incredibly stupid, and often it makes the player think that they're going places that they aren't supposed to. Maybe you could pass off this ladder point as a feature and not a bug in the system, but I'm not sold on that. I simply don't like going up a hillside and feeling as though I'm gliding up a cliff face that I shouldn't be allowed to go up. Like, seriously, just lower the incline of this hillside so that it looks less ridiculous. Or steep it up a little bit further and make it so I can't run up it without sliding back down. I don't feel like I'm asking for too much here. Just that the ground behave in a way similar to reality. Granted, some players won't mind this type of thing. This is a pet peeve of mine that's been bugging me for over a decade since Skyrim came out initially. It's been a thing in all Bethesda games for ages now that I think about it. Even in Fallout 3 it was a problem, but there wasn't a lot of outdoor sort of nature exploration in that game, just ruins, so it wasn't as obvious there, but it's bugged me for a long time, and unfortunately it's here too. Might not bug you, but it bugs me. Maybe it's that the developers think that because Bethesda Game Studios gets away with it, they can too. But I'm done with that excuse. It looks stupid, feels bad, and tears me out of any immersion that I felt in that moment. Now, other elements of on-foot exploration, it's pretty much just comprised of running around, stealthily sneaking around while crouched. Nothing too exciting or magnificent here. I will say there were multiple times where I was actually trying to go someplace that I definitely was supposed to go to, but the game's level designers didn't anticipate how much head clearance there needed to be, so they built levels out with, for example, stairs that didn't have enough clearance above the steps, so as you walked up the stairs, you would hit your head and the character model would become locked in place. Like in this particular quest line where I'm going to this guy to get a gem that I need to retrieve for Lady Stephanie, I believe it is, if I'm remembering correctly off the dome here. But this is like, it's just dumb. Like, in order to go up these stairs, I have to crouch and crawl up on all fours, basically, because there isn't enough clearance. Even though you look at these stairs, there should be clearance. The other characters are able to go up with no problem, but I can't. But without a doubt, the overwhelming majority of exploration time will be spent on your horse, which will require roughly probably 10 hours into the game is when you unlock it. And it totally opens up the world because you can not only travel a lot faster, but it also makes fast travel very applicable and justifiable. You see, how fast travel works in this game is actually really interesting, and I really like it. Basically, nothing is for free, so you will open up your map and choose the location that you want to fast travel to, so long as you're not actively engaged in combat, you know, the normal stuff. You select the location you want to go to, but you will realize that there's a set amount of time it will take you to travel to that location. You don't just instantly appear there. Furthermore, because it actually takes in-game time to travel, regardless of whether you are doing it yourself on foot or on horseback or using the fast travel system, all of your stats will deplete in real time. So your amount of energy will deplete, your hunger will deplete, and if you have bleeding wounds and other injuries that could possibly affect your overall health, that could also decline over time. It's really cool because it makes it so every time you want to make a big trip on horseback across the map, you have to basically plan it out. Make sure you have enough food, make sure you've rested up, because if you don't, you could end up getting in a really rough spot. In addition, there are also chances of encounters while you travel, again, whether it's on foot, horseback, or through the fast travel system. So if you're simply riding your horse across a field, there is a set percentage chance that you encounter thieves, bandits, it could be somebody asking for help, it could be a body laying there that you need to investigate, and every time that happens, you are given the opportunity to stop or to continue along your way with a set percentage chance likelihood that you'll be successful in either which way. And these encounters are actually very practical and pragmatic based off of your current positioning in the game's world. So if you are fast traveling at night on foot, the odds of you being jumped by bandits, especially while going through heavily wooded areas, spikes dramatically. You can almost guarantee that you will get jumped and attacked, which early in the game is basically a death sentence. Compare that to riding through open fields, it's not as big of a risk because those bandits don't want to hang out in areas where they could be easily seen. Makes sense. Furthermore, on really narrow roads, it's really difficult for you to escape and avoid those encounters when they appear. So chances are if you get jumped, you're not getting out of it. It makes the horse seem so unbelievably useful once you finally get access to it after, again, about 10 hours or so in the game. It's just a total game changer because all of a sudden the world opens up, not just because you can ride between locations quickly, but because now fast travel is actually practical. You can trust that your horse will get you from point A to point B quickly and reliably, and even if you are jumped, your odds of escaping quickly without dealing with bandits or any sort of surprise ambush go up dramatically. So it's much more reasonable to fast travel and to go to a lot more places in a lot shorter time. Now, speaking of those horses specifically, there are some interesting elements to their design. You see, horses have an assortment of stats that affect their speed, carrying capacity, and even controllability. Speed is self-explanatory. Carrying capacity basically just means that you can move items from your inventory onto the horse into the saddlebag so that you can still move around and fast travel while carrying a lot of stuff. And then, of course, controllability is just ease of control, how responsive they are to your commands. It's another reason why horses totally change the game once you get access to them, because the carrying capacity alone makes hunting practical. Prior to that, you would go out, you could hunt a deer, but a quarter of the meat would be so heavy that you couldn't reasonably expect to carry any more than that quarter of the total meat produced back to the poacher or the butcher, whoever you happen to be selling the meat to. Whereas once you get the horse, the increased carrying capacity makes it so you can justify going out, killing a few rabbits and a couple deer, taking all of that meat back at once and selling it all together at the same time. It makes it very, very practical. Which again, I love. It makes sense in the world, and it's practical because Henry himself would want to be able to go out hunting, but he's not going to be able to throw 2 deer over each shoulder and carry them miles to the closest town or village. So once he gets a horse, of course he's able to carry more meat. It only makes sense, and it makes that particular gameplay addition feel truly useful, and it's something that a lot of players who are starting the game will sprint towards because it greatly improves the overall gameplay experience once you're able to engage in all of these systems. Now, after spending a lot of time testing and trying to pay close attention to these different stats, I can confidently say that I can't really tell the difference between one horse that's supposedly better than another. At times it felt as though I was noticing a speed difference, that one horse had more stamina than another, but it was never anything conclusive, and certainly not something that would drive me to go out and spend my time and more groschen collecting a better horse. It just didn't feel worth it. But even if you could tell the difference between one horse that's statistically better than another horse, there are very few avenues for you to go through to actually acquire that better horse. They're all going to be legit because the game doesn't actually have robust systems in place to allow you to steal horses. You can go out, find a good horse, and take it for yourself, but you can't actually assign it to yourself. You can't go and try to sell it to a mill. Like, you can't do anything with it. You're just going to use it until you hit a story cutscene or some sort of quest that causes it to despawn, and then it's gone forever, and you're just dealing with the consequences of having stolen a horse. You can't make them your own, you can't offload them through the millers, and this means that there's very little reason to skill horses outside of narrative beats, especially since you're going to receive a horse fairly early in the game that can be summoned at any time. And because you can't really tell the difference between the two horses, there's not much of an incentive to go and skill a better one, even over the short term. Unfortunately, as it stands, the mechanic of stealing horses, which is something they set up pretty clearly early in the game, basically has no use in the core gameplay loop. The only time it makes sense to steal a horse is when the story forces you to do it, because the other systems that only make sense for a mechanic like this aren't set up to handle it. Now, narratively speaking, this probably makes sense. Rumors would certainly begin to swirl if a ton of stolen horses began flooding local stables. Pretty soon, no doubt, local authorities would start to notice that you were the one constantly bringing them in, and in no time, you would probably be questioned and thrown in jail or slapped with a huge fine or just outright executed. So I can absolutely understand why the developers might feel as though rewarding the player for horse theft would be more trouble than it's worth. However, I would counter by saying that there are many mechanics in this game that punish the player for engaging in. Even something as simple as eating can have major negative status effects if it's done too much. Just because the local authorities would likely have questions for you, or even find out, doesn't mean that it should be withheld from the player as an option. It's not to say that every stable hand should be willing to pay top dollar for a stolen horse in the game, but it is to say that it would be nice if those characters even considered the option. You could go to a stable hand and offer a horse for sale that you had recently stolen. You could even ask for a lower price so long as they took the horse off of your hands with no questions asked. They could even interrogate you, asking where you stole the horse from or where it should be looked for if authorities were to search for it, in which case the horses stolen from farther away from the stable you're currently at would be worth a lot more than the horses stolen from nearby, because those are ones that are going to obviously garner more suspicion. So all of a sudden, you're incentivized to actively participate in this criminal enterprise of riding to the outskirts of the map, stealing horses there, riding them all the way across the map, and selling them as far as they could possibly be away from the original location. That would be a gameplay loop in and of itself that could be justifiable. And even then, they could still turn you down because it's not worth the risk, potentially even tipping off local authorities that there's a sketchy guy trying to sell what seems to be a stolen horse. That would effectively solve the problem in my mind. It would make it an option for players, but it would make it one that's so risky it's effectively stupid to engage with it. Because, after all, a major element of freedom in video games is giving players the ability to do things that are smart and the ability to do things that are stupid and detrimental to their own goals. It's one of the reasons that people love RPGs so much, because it allows you to live out whatever crazy fantasy you might want to, even if it's objectively insane and could result in a much shorter overall time with the game. But you know what, it's not that big of a deal. Sure, you can't steal horses and then sell them and treat that as its own criminal enterprise, even though certain story beats will treat it as though it is a valid enterprise. It's not that big of a deal, but it's little things like this that start to add up when you start to notice that there's a lot of really good ideas in Kingdom Come Deliverance, but a lot of them are just surface level. They're not actually thought through and borne out throughout the entire game world, which is hopefully what we see happen in a sequel. Now, as for general exploration of the game's world, this mostly settles on world design itself, trying to create a map that's actually worth exploring for its own sake. And this is something I think the game actually struggles with a fair amount, because while I do think there are some really beautiful sections in the game, there aren't enough major set pieces to make it feel as though you could stumble onto one at any moment while exploring forests and ravines. The closest they get to is having these little accident sites on roadsides, and if you happen to stop at one, you can find interesting items, notes, or perhaps even a body or two laying nearby. There's nothing too complex here, it's just a fun little set piece that's meant to give more context to the world and perhaps even tie into a local side quest. There are mine shafts, bandit encampments, entire cities to be found, and all of that is worth exploring for its own sake, but in terms of generalized exploration through the main open world, usually you're just going to be running along trails and through large open grass fields or thick, dense forests. Other than the cities and castles, nothing here really feels hand-placed or hand-designed. It all just feels very, very procedural. I don't know how else to put it. The forests are very, very dense, but are generally flat and not that interesting. Like, there's trees everywhere, and some of them might have locations contained within that feature deer, boar hunting sites, and the like, which are worth exploring and finding out, because that's a great way to make money. But exploring that forest after you initially discover it isn't really worth doing. You know what makes me really appreciate the design work from Bethesda Game Studios? They are the masters of open world design, specifically making a large map so densely packed with content that it's enjoyable to explore even dozens or hundreds of hours after you first step foot into that map. It's something they're very, very good at. And Kingdom Come Deliverance just doesn't really meet that standard. It's just not there. There's too much emptiness, there aren't enough interesting things to stop and grab your attention, and as a result, it feels largely empty. And sure, they can get away with this a lot better than a game like Fallout 4 or even Skyrim, because this is supposed to be more realistic and grounded, but at the same time, I can say that just because it's supposed to be realistic doesn't mean that they can get away with making an uninteresting open world, or a world that's not fun to explore for its own sake. It may be realistic, but it's still a video game at the end of the day, and it needs to hold to the same expectations and standards that have been established for every other major open world game for the last 20 years. Now, one of the ways that the game will regularly try to push you into situations where you have a reason to explore the open world are with fetch quests. earlier I mentioned the example of the starter quest after the prologue, where you will be tasked with going to a grave, digging up the body, and retrieving a ring that's on his hand. That's an example of a fetch quest, and later in the game they keep doing this over and over and over again. Even in one quest line, you could have multiple items that you have to go out and fetch just because the person wants you to go get them. They could have other servants, other people at their command that would be much more reasonable mules, but they still ask you for some reason. Such as this example, where you need to help out Lady Stephanie acquire some items for a wedding. She needs you to fetch the wine, the roan, which is just a horse, and a crown, which was supposed to be delivered weeks ago, but is far behind schedule. You basically have to hunt these items down and bring them back. She could have hired other people to do it. She has an entire army at her disposal, basically. She could have asked any of them, or even 3 of them, to go fetch these items all at the same time. But instead, you are tasked with doing it for some reason. I mean, later we find out that perhaps she has a bit of a crush on you, and maybe that's why she's asking you to help to, I guess, get closer to you, but that seems like a bit of a stretch. But even so, you just have to go out to the rough locations where these are hidden at and find them. The wine you have to basically play for during an archery tournament. The horse you have to go grab and then ride all the way back to the stable, and while you're riding it, you have to sing a song, otherwise it rears and kicks you off. I will say this was one of the funnier moments in any side quest that I encountered. It was kind of funny. You've got to sing to the horse the whole time you ride it. It's just funny. And then going and fetching the crown, which is particularly dramatic. You just go speak to this guy, say, hey, I need this thing. He's like, oh, well, the rock never showed up. You gotta go find it. So you go find the rock, then you bring it back, and then he's like, give me a couple days and I'll fix it. And you give him a couple days just by going outside and then sitting on a chair and passing time for 2 days. And then you come back up, he gives it to you, and you run back to Lady Stephanie. Not that exciting. I mean, again, I want to be more sympathetic than not with these things, because it's hard to design side quests for a game, period, much less for an open world game that's trying to be relatively grounded in reality and somewhat realistic. So I can appreciate that they probably were like, I don't know, we'll just have them ride around and get stuff. I don't know what else we need to do, especially because the combat isn't that engaging to begin with. So they effectively just have this over-reliance on fetch quests because they probably realized pretty early on that sending people out to go and take on bandit camps and things wasn't that fun because the combat sucked, so they relied on this. It's not great, but I guess it's the better of the 2 options. But as we learned with The Witcher 3, there are some really fun ways that you can create more content, even outside of the core gameplay loop that you would be engaging with throughout the main story, whether it's combat or bartering or any number of other things, such as acting in plays that different characters are putting on, or trying to negotiate a deal between 2 parties, or needing to do research on local wildlife and fauna, or perhaps experimenting with different crafting and alchemy abilities to find an item that's going to be of use to a given character. All of that stuff could be really fun, challenging, and unique to this world, while being better than a fetch quest. Now, actually, a really great example of a moment in this game that pulls off side content and secondary objectives really, really well is the Woman's Lot DLC, which is actually pretty polarizing. A lot of people loved it, a lot of people hated it, but I actually thought it was pretty good. In this DLC, you will play as Teresa. It lets you explore the starting area from her point of view, which is as mundane as you would expect, and yet it's oddly charming. You perform various menial tasks, such as feeding the chickens, weeding the garden, feeding the dog, and going into town to run some errands for your father. And while I certainly wouldn't want to play a 20-hour game that's nothing but this, getting the opportunity to live the simple life is actually fairly refreshing, especially because the opening dozen or so hours of Kingdom Come Deliverance are pretty exhausting, both emotionally and in terms of the taxing gameplay. A lot happens, and the game demands a lot from the player. Getting the opportunity to just slow down and smell the roses, almost literally, is a really nice addition. And so while I enjoy it, I really didn't expect to see something like this here. Just because I enjoy it doesn't mean that I think it was a safe bet on the part of the developers. You see, it adds a lot narratively to Teresa as a character, but when developing ideas for DLC, I could certainly see how something like this could be cut without much thought. After all, it's kind of hard to justify spending time developing an entire sequence where you are literally playing as a farmhand when the rest of the game is about combat and role-playing. But that latter element is the exact reason why this works so well, in my opinion. Exploring the world through somebody else's eyes helps you gain a greater understanding of said world, and it works really well to expose the player to all new perspectives. And this isn't the first time that this has been done, or even the most recent time that it's been implemented in a game. Red Dead Redemption 2, for example, uses the epilogue sequence to change the rhythm and pace of gameplay significantly to reset player expectations, emotions, and to give them a new outlook on the world that's been created. In that epilogue, you will literally spend hours upon hours working as a farmhand or building up your own farmstead after an extended ending sequence for the base game that includes some of the most elaborate combat sequences that Rockstar has ever designed. It's about as much of a 180 as you could possibly pull, and yet it works fantastically well. The reason it works so well is because it resets the player's perspective so that they are once again vulnerable to the emotional manipulation that's involved in most storytelling. If all you do in Kingdom Come Deliverance is run around hacking and slashing, you shouldn't be surprised when the player grows disconnected from the NPCs and from their stories of their troubles, however small they may be. But if you take these moments to reset the perspective and help the player understand that there is more to this world than just their own escapades, you can craft a more captivating and engaging world on the whole. But that being said, I don't think these sequences are perfect, and I think this DLC does have its problems. Now, when we're bringing up the idea of pacing in a game, I think that we can point to these sequences in this DLC as the most egregious offenders. Even though I think they serve a narrative purpose, I think it's not refined or polished enough to really maximize the actual benefit. I really appreciate the narrative reason that this DLC is here, but the activities you'll be engaging in are just as, if not more, mundane than the worst side content in the main campaign. It shakes up pace, certainly, which is a very good thing, and it also tasks the player with completing various tasks that you probably won't be completing in the base game. However, it dwells on this for far too long. It's like when I was shopping for a car, like a year and a half ago. I was looking for something that was going to be a nice commuter car that I could take on the highway because I had to commute to Denver from where I lived at the time every single morning, which is like an hour and 15-minute drive. So every morning and every evening I was driving an hour and 15 minutes there, hour 15 minutes back, just to go to work Monday through Friday. Exhausting, don't recommend it, especially if you have to be at work at 8 a.m. But setting that aside, I was shopping for a car. I went into the dealership. A couple of the dealerships I went to were terrible, but one I found had a very bored and very passionate salesman. And he made a point of trying to contrast the different options before me, the different things that I could enjoy, almost like gameplay elements in a video game. Some really good cars, some really awful cars. So what he did is he would take me in a total piece of garbage, and we would drive around the lot. Be like, so you feel this bump, you feel that, when you crank the wheel you feel that, when you try to press this button you hear that grinding sound as the sunroof opens. That's all terrible. Now let me take you over to our really nice car. You'll appreciate that. So the pace of that sales experience is up in balance, and it's in throws, and he's trying to get it to feel just right so that I'm compelled to go with the nicer car out of the two options. And then after we get done with the nice car, he takes me over and we try the crappy car again. And then he takes me back over and we try another nice car. And then he shows me another crappy car. And he's pitching this as, I'm giving you options and you're seeing this and you're seeing all of the options, the good and the bad, so you can make an informed decision. But what he's actually doing is just trying to push me into the nice stuff by making me really hate the crappy stuff. And in this case, like with Kingdom Come Deliverance, that's all good and dandy. I can appreciate being shown the crappy stuff in comparison to the good stuff, so that I can appreciate when it's done well, and I can appreciate when it's done badly, because it shakes up the pace and it makes me sort of reset my expectations for gameplay. But when you focus on the crappy car too much, I'm just left wondering what the hell I'm doing here. I'm taking an entire afternoon to try out nice cars, and you're driving me around in like a 2006 Honda Civic. I don't mean to insult you if that happens to be the car that you drive. If you're one of the Uber operator had severe body damage and probably like a bench frame, probably wasn't legal to drive, but even so, if you focus on the bad stuff too much, even if there's a tactical reason you're doing it, sometimes you end up just losing the audience in the process. That was a really complicated way of just saying, I think they have too much like gardening in this DLC and not enough fighting and like different stuff. I think they have too much gardening. That's basically what I'm saying. Throughout the opening couple of hours of the DLC, which is around 5 hours in total, all you'll be doing is speaking to NPCs, working through predetermined dialogue trees that don't actually have any real variability or branching options. You'll be speaking to people to find out what they need you to fetch for them, going out and fetching said items for yourself, and engaging in extremely repetitious activities such as the aforementioned weed pulling. And again, I understand that this isn't necessarily supposed to be fun. You are just being put into the position of somebody who works manual jobs and whose life isn't that exciting, so that when they contrast it later with what her life becomes, you appreciate where she ended up. I can understand that, but it doesn't change the fact that for a video game, it's still bland and boring. Again, just because there's a tactical narrative reason for doing something doesn't mean that you are free from all of the basic requirements of a video game, which is that it's engaging and not tediously boring. Such as in Death Stranding, I get it, you're shipping boxes between two locations, and because the nation has fallen, there's no infrastructure in place like roads or zip lines or anything like that. So you're going to be walking and running most of the way. It's narratively justified, but it's still just walking. And that's the whole game. It can make sense, but that doesn't mean that it's a good game, you know? Like, we could make a video game that's just IRS Tax Auditor Simulator 2022. And all you do is audit randomly generated tax returns. Does it make sense? Yeah. We could even set up a system where, like, if you don't do a good enough job, then you get fired, and then your wife divorces you and all of your children are taken from you as you are admitted into an insane asylum. It could be all justified narratively speaking, but is that a fun game? Is that a good game? Probably not. Though I'll be real, I would probably play it. It sounds kind of fun. All of this to say, while I can appreciate what this DLC was trying to do, and while I think it does shake up the monotony of the base gameplay loop, I don't think it gets the pacing quite right in a way where it makes you really appreciate the things that it brings to the table while also appreciating the things that the base game had. Instead, it just feels like a 5-hour detour where all you do is like walk around fetching things and living a boring life as a farmhand, and like that's it. It's like that's it. It's a great narrative DLC. If you want to learn more about this world and more about Teresa and see everything that happened in the opening hours of the game from a different perspective, absolutely give it a shot. It's actually pretty good in that regard. But in terms of gameplay, it's not tremendous. It shakes it up, which is good, but then it just focuses on all the wrong elements of the shake-up for far too long. Now lastly, let's touch on a couple of random things that I think need to be addressed. For one, there's some weird eccentricities in the game that are probably a result of technical restrictions or just oversights on the part of the developers. For example, fines for committing crimes. That sort of rhymed, but not really. Anyway, you commit a crime such as beating somebody up, trying to steal something, and a guard will chase you down if you are seen doing this or it's been reported and they can tie you to it somehow. A guard will come up to you and demand recompense. You have to pay a set fine, or you're gonna have the item taken back, go to jail, possibly die, and reset fully. Later on in the game, depending on what your stats are, you can sometimes intimidate the guards to basically leave you alone, which is basically just at that point a free pass to steal and do whatever you want, which is really fun, don't get me wrong. I mean, it kind of totally breaks the game, but it's certainly fun. But even after 30 to 40 hours in the game, I had so much gold and groschen in my inventory that the fines they were levying against me were basically of no consequence. Like, I would have 5,000 groschen, and then they would fine me 30 for something I did randomly, for like breaking in and stealing some item that was really worthwhile. And so I'm like, yeah, I'll pay your fine, whatever. I already sold the item, so I'm not gonna give it back to you. I'm totally good. Take your fine, whatever. I don't care. It never felt as though the punishment for the crime was enough to keep me from committing it. I mean, going back to what we discussed previously, maybe these rules and fines are only set in place for the opening hours of the game to get players to play on the straight and narrow, while those fines really have a negative impact on them. But that doesn't really seem to be the case, just because it ends up being so totally out of balance during the mid and late game that it just doesn't make sense to avoid committing crimes at all. You can just go out, be a crazy bandit, do whatever you want, and they'll fine you a little bit here and there. It's not a big deal. For some serious crimes, yes, the guards will just attack you and they'll try to kill you, and if you don't get away, you're probably going to die because, like I said, fighting multiple guards at the same time is an absolute nightmare. Even if you're experienced and know what you're doing in combat, it still just kind of sucks and is clunky, and sometimes you die through no fault of your own, just because the camera kept swapping back between different characters and you couldn't figure out what the hell was going on. Something simple like a percentage-based fine could have worked really, really well. In other words, if you have 1,000 groschen in your inventory, you commit some crime that's particularly egregious, that's in this tier, that's a 10% fine on whatever your net worth is, so you have to pay out 100 groschen in that case. That would be much more effective, I think, than just an arbitrary number that gets generated somehow that I can't seem to figure out. This is coming from the wiki, and based on their research, which actually lines up with everything that I've seen as well, it looks as though the fines are just arbitrary amounts that have been set in place by the developers, and they don't change based on where you are in the game or what motivated or was tied to the particular activity that was a crime. So in the case of this, like stealing, looting, unconscious or dead non-bandit bodies results in a fine of 60 groschen. Doesn't matter what you stole, doesn't matter how valuable it was, doesn't matter the social status of the particular individual you stole from, if they were a lowly gent or if they were very wealthy, it doesn't matter. Lockpicking, same thing, 300 groschen, 10 days in jail if you can't pay it, which does suck, but again, like 40, 50 hours in the game, that's really not that much. Reckless riding, which is a particularly infuriating one because the horses tend to control like ass in cities because there's so many buildings and things that are in the way that you have to kind of navigate your way through. So in order to actually avoid a person, you usually end up just ramming into another. So like this is a really frustrating one because I've definitely been slapping that one a lot. Killing somebody, that one results, there's no fine. You just go straight to jail, right away, straight to jail.
You undercook fish, believe it or not, jail. You overcook chicken, also jail.
Now, like I said, if you can't pay these fines, you do have the option to basically go to jail to pay your fine in effect, and the guards are going to take the object that you stole, or if you got any sort of profit from your criminal activity, they will take that away from you regardless. So crime doesn't usually pay, but even when crime does pay, the punishment for the crime is so minimal that there really isn't much reason to avoid crime in the first place, you know? So it's just, what's the point? Like, I get it, you want to leave the door open for players to be able to commit crimes without having an hour of gameplay time totally ruined. I can appreciate that and understand that, but I do think if you're going to try to have a realistic world with authority figures that the player needs to respect, you have to take steps to make the punishments fit the crime. In the case of murder, usually guards would just chase you down and beat you to death, and that kind of makes sense. They caught you murdering somebody, you should probably die for that. They're not going to be very understanding about it. But for a lot of these other crimes, it's just going to result in you paying a little fine and going about your business. If there were much steeper fines or fines that directly related to your level, or like it works in other games such as Skyrim and, for example, a lot of mods that were released for Fallout New Vegas, where the fine would actually adjust to your overall player level, and if you couldn't pay it, you had to forfeit items in your inventory to reach that level of payout to pay your fine. Just like if you owe money to the IRS, you know, they're going to come and seize items to basically make up that difference. That would make sense. That, I think, would make crime while potentially profitable, a really questionable activity, and you would really have to think pretty clearly as to whether or not you wanted to engage in it. I think one of the reasons the developers felt as though they didn't need to worry about that was because they do have a system in place where if you are caught repeatedly committing crimes in one area over and over and over again, people will grow to distrust you, and even if you go to jail, you do get a debuff that's called the released prisoner debuff, which basically just causes you to lose strength, agility, and vitality for a set period of time, and as a result, people, when you try to barter with them, will look at you with a lot of skepticism and skeptical hippo eyes. They won't want to work with you, and for good reason. You're a criminal. Makes sense. But I think the temporary threat of a debuff just is not enough to truly affect a player's actions, because I know from my own experience, I am much more likely to go, if I receive this debuff, and just hang out in the woods hunting for a set period of time until that debuff wears off. And then once it wears off, I'll come back into town and everything will be right as rain. No problem. You know, in games like Red Dead Redemption 2, I'm sorry, I keep bringing it up, it's just so tremendously fantastic. We have situations where bounties are levied against you, and usually those bounties are pretty steep and very expensive. And if you're seen in that area where the bounty is currently placed, you're going to be attacked on sight. It's not going to go well for you. And so it actually affects your gameplay experience pretty severely, so you can go commit crimes and murder people, be a terrible person, but it's going to have a very negative effect on your experience in the game moving forward, and that action has an equal and opposite reaction. And the last thing I want to touch on are just the skills in general. As I've mentioned throughout the course of this video, there are a handful of skills that, while interesting initially, end up just totally breaking the system that they are tied to. The best example being that final offer skill, which just totally breaks the bartering system to the point where there's no reason to really engage with any other skills with regards to monetary negotiation, because you just broke it. Like, you're going to pretty much every single time get the best possible price by just initially offering the lowest possible price. They'll come down, you get another option, and then you meet them there. That's all it is. And so while it's a skill that the developers put in place as a reward for experience in the game, it just ends up breaking the system that it's supposed to basically further your engagement in, and it doesn't make any sense. It's like giving a skill for hand-to-hand combat, which makes you one punch man, where every single punch is an instant kill. It's like, okay, well, I mean, it's a strong ability, but it kind of broke the whole thing. Like, I don't know why you put that there. That's kind of dumb. There's also another skill that you can acquire called Dreadful, which is aimed towards addressing an issue that I've brought up many, many times over the course of this video, and that is multiple enemies in a single encounter. Basically, it makes you dreadful. So enemies look at you and feel dread, and it greatly increases the odds that enemies will flee during combat, leaving you to only fight one or maybe two when initially there were 4 or 5. And I thought this was just me, but it's not. I looked it up and it's apparently still a major issue. This skill is just like totally broken. When you have it equipped and you've earned it and put it on Henry, enemies will just regularly like not spawn like at all. They just won't show up. So you'll have entire combat encounters that are scripted for the main story, and the enemies will just never show up. You're just like standing around, the combat music will start up, and you're ready to go, and Henry's even delivering dialogue like, "Come here, I've got you." But no enemies. It's really, really dumb. It also seems like a really weird patch fix for an issue. Like, imagine any other game. Hey, we have this racing game that we're making, and there's an issue where this particular class of cars, they have this problem where if they drive over water, the car thinks that it's falling through the ground and it's just disappearing. So instead of actually lowering traction and you drift, the car just despawns out of the map and everybody has to reset. It's a major glitch. It's a big problem. Not fun at all. And then the developers are like, I know the solution. We'll add in an ability that the driver can unlock, which removes all of the water puddles in all of the levels. No more bug, no more issue. It's like, well, I mean, I guess it fixes it, like, I guess, but that's like if you have a splinter in your hand and then you just cut off your hand at the wrist. It's like, yeah, I guess you don't have a splinter anymore, but you kind of like just totally destroyed the whole thing that you were trying to protect and save. Like, it just doesn't make any damn sense at all. And there's a lot of systems like this at play in a game like Kingdom Come Deliverance. And to wrap all of this up, I think in general, Kingdom Come Deliverance is a really great game. I know we've been bashing on it for the last little bit, but that's because there's a lot of jank to bash on. As I said at the beginning, I think this game is something special, and I think it's one of the most immersive games that I've played in recent memory. I really do. But there are a lot of issues, and pretending that the issues don't exist doesn't do us, the players, or the developers any favors at all. They need to hear this stuff called out so that they can address it and fix it for the sequel. In many ways, a lot of these problems are actually sort of a compliment to the developers, because if I had just problems with how the game was generally set up and how the gameplay loop was established and the premise of the game entirely, going back to the example of like IRS audit simulator, if I had problems like that, this would be a very different video. But this video is more generally meant to discuss the things that I think are very fixable and very addressable in a sequel. And most of these problems, I think, came out of the game slowly being developed and slowly realizing what it wanted to be and what it was going to be in the end. And as a result, there are some ideas that were introduced later in development and other ideas that were introduced pretty early on, and as a result there's just some friction and some things aren't as fleshed out as they should be, and etc, etc. I think with a sequel they could very easily get all of this stuff laid out clearly on the table ahead of time, and then they could step forward into the development of the sequel knowing exactly what they want to do and how they want it to work. They have the vision clearly in front of them. We're going to do what we did in the first game, but just really, really well. That is the game I want. This, but polished and refined like hell. But as always, there's mitigating circumstances, complexities, you never really know, and who knows, maybe they've been so quiet up until now about what they're working on next because they aren't actually working on a sequel to Kingdom Come, and they're working on something totally different. Who knows? We can only assume it's something more in the line of Kingdom Come Deliverance, but we'll just have to wait and see. What I do know is whatever it is, I am keenly interested and eagerly anticipating. Let me know your thoughts on Kingdom Come Deliverance as well in the comment section below the like button. I'd love to hear what you have to think. Come over and join me on Twitch. You've seen a bunch of Twitch gameplay over the course of the video. That was all recorded live with you guys, some of you guys that were there in chat when it was happening. So if you want to be one of those lucky people to hang out and get in a video, hop over, say hi. And of course, follow all of my social media links in the link tree, again, in the description box. Like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to get notified of when the Horizon Forbidden West and Elden Ring critiques go live. Those are my next big project right after this, so those are quickly on their way. But with that, I love you all very, very much, more than you could possibly know, and I'll see you in the next video. Hugs and kisses. Bye-bye. As many of you guys know, I am a huge fan of the Assassin's Creed games. I have been for a long time, and I love these games for a lot of very complicated and often conflicting reasons. I love the realistic recreation of historical cities and sites and cultures, the ability to explore places and cultures that no longer exist. I find it really cool. The free running system is extremely satisfying and fun, and the stealth is always rewarding and yet challenging. So naturally, I have not had a great time in the last few years of Assassin's Creed, which is why I've decided to go back and play a game that I think is freakishly underrated. I've talked about it a few times before. If you follow me over on Twitch, you've heard me talk about it many times before. But today we're going to explore Assassin's Creed Unity. I'm going to try to explain just why I think it's such a special game that more people should give a chance. And to do that, we're going to actually have to play the game. Join me over at the desk. Ooh, okay, let's get into it. But first I want to say a quick thank you to our sponsor, Wondershare. So as you can see, we've got a collection of a bunch of different reactions and things that you can download straight off of this film stock Wondershare site, and you can put it on whatever videos you want, clips you want, turn it into something funny. Go crazy. Now, if you don't have any editing software, that's not a big deal. Don't worry. Wondershare has got you covered. You see, Wondershare Filmora and Film Go come into play here. In Filmora, you can just find the effects package named Luke Stevens Gaming Journey Pack. Then you just overlay my face sticker onto whatever video you want to make with Filmora, and it works great. Or if you don't have a high-end computer or anything to edit on, you can actually edit straight off of your mobile device using Filmora Go, which is a mobile app that you can download that is extremely easy to use itself. And I know these videos seem really complicated, like how do I even begin making something like this? And the simple answer is use good tools. Work smarter, not harder. And Filmora and Filmora Go are applications that are designed for beginning video editors to get their feet on the ground. So if you want to start making videos or put my face onto some memes just for the hell of it, then go for it. Check it out at the link in the video description box below. And when you guys make some content using these packs, make sure to use hashtag #LukeWithWondershare so I get notified of all of your interesting and fun creations. Share them on social media, Twitter, Reddit, wherever. I'll check them out and I'll make sure to share my favorites. Again, check them out at the download link in the video description box below and in the pinned comment. But okay, with that said, let's get into it. So Assassin's Creed Unity launched back in 2014 to mixed reviews. Long story short, the game was freakishly broken when it launched and spawned many memes and long-lasting criticisms that this series had fallen by the wayside and was damned to drift into obscurity. I mean, the meme potential alone was extraordinary, and it came at the perfect time because 2014, if you recall, was when all of these loot box boxes and crazy pay-to-win schemes were first finding their way into AAA gaming in a real notable way. And Ubisoft comes along with a game that features co-op and multiplayer with a very robust in-game store, which has, I'm just going to be real, pay-to-win mechanics within it. And it was broken and unfinished, so it fit exactly what game journalists and game consumer advocates were looking for as a scapegoat and as a symbol of what you don't do. And I should be clear, when I say pay to win, this is a single player game. There are co-op missions and things you can play with friends. That's actually pretty well done. We'll get to that later. But when I say pay to win, what I'm referring to is the ability to buy these Helix credits, which you can then use to redeem weapons in the game, which are extremely powerful. And you can also buy time saver packs, which allow you to redeem more currency and experience points just by playing the game normally. These are the things that are still present in Assassin's Creed games, including Valhalla, to this day. And this game is weird because it comes at a middle point between transitionary steps in Assassin's Creed as a franchise, because it still has missions like this, where you're tackling criminals and thieves and exploring the city generally like you would have in, say, Assassin's Creed 3 or even Rogue or Brotherhood or one of those. And yet it still features a lot of different mechanics that were interesting and new, such as the 4-player co-op missions, which allowed you to go through main story missions with a friend, or dedicated missions on the side, which were just built around playing with multiple people, and they work really well. Now, in the years since the game's launch, it has seen many, many patches and improvements, though it's not perfect. I've said this before, I think it is playable now and it is ready to be enjoyed, but there are still problems. For example, at this very moment that I just paused the game, you can see in the distance, there's just a chunk of building missing. See that? Right above his head? There's just a piece of the building missing. There's also the occasional frame drop. There are NPCs that go crazy. If you look in the distance, right above Arno's head, you can see pop-in from NPCs like crazy. And bear in mind, this is running on a PC that costs about $5,000 to purchase new. So it's not a hardware issue, it's a software issue. And there are tons of problems still present today. Now, you might have a really high resistance to this type of thing. It might not bother you, and if it doesn't, I highly recommend you jump on the game now, because everything else is still very robust. It's just unfortunate that there's a lot of clunk around the overall tech that's at the core of this game. I mean, even now, on this computer, it's running at over 100 frames a second. It's just that we still have to deal with some pop-in and other data streaming issues that Ubisoft just wasn't able to fix before the game launched, and now it's too late to change it because the engine is baked in. But one thing the engine really does have, which I still insist is extremely impressive to this day, now 8 years after this game launched, is one of the most robust and impressive lighting engines that's ever released in a AAA open world game. Seriously, what they're able to do in some of the cutscenes and with subsurface scattering is just out of this world. Like it really competes with the likes of Red Dead Redemption and other big titles that have hundreds of millions of dollars behind them. And it's really bizarre because we contrast the really great lighting engine for cutscenes and things with the quality of data streaming and the way that the rest of the game is built. And it's a little bizarre because we have something great right here, and then elsewhere we have texture pop-in and artifacting right there above Arno's head. We have a bunch of low-res textures over here, and then in front of this building, of course, the textures are really poor, and on that roof it's really rough. But then we look off in the distance and those textures are better. So just in general, there's a big problem with how the game handles the data that it streams in and displays. But setting aside graphical issues, which are just part of the game at this point, though they are improved over the launch of the game, they still are present. Let's talk about some of the things that this game does really well. And I want to start with something that just doesn't exist in modern Assassin's Creed games, and it's something I'm doing right now. And that is actual free climbing. That doesn't look like it's copy and pasted out of a mobile game. The control scheme is far more complicated, with you having to hold down right trigger to activate the free running system, and then holding down B or A in order to free climb up or down a particular object. The controls are far more complicated, with you having to hold down R2 to activate free running, and then holding down A or B to tell the game basically whether you wanted to free run up or down in general, and it allows you to do some really cool moves as you work your way down buildings with an animation set that is far more comprehensive than anything that exists in this franchise nowadays. You know, it's funny because often when we talk about sequels and later releases in a franchise, we're talking about generalized improvements and ways that they took things up a notch. But in this case, this free running system is just not in Assassin's Creed anymore. They stripped it out and replaced it with very basic running animations where you can run up walls straight up and then climb up, and then you run up a little further. Okay, that was a bug. Oh, yeah, okay, we're glitching a little. Yeah, he's just gonna keep doing it. He's just gonna keep freaking out. That's funny. But it's kind of sad because they did all of this work for the animation systems and everything working together for the free climbing mechanic, and then they just stripped it out of future releases in favor of a simplified, streamlined version of the free running system. And it's worse by almost every metric compared to this. If they had just taken this system, copy and pasted it into later games, but just polished it up, it would be remarkable. It'd be phenomenal. The best free climbing system in any of these games. But instead, they just cut it out, and it's really too bad. But it serves as the first example of a phenomenon that I call the Unity effect. And it's when a studio puts out a game that doesn't do well for any reason. Let's say, just call the reason X. In this case, X being severe technical issues. But then the publisher and the corporate heads that decide whether or not a game is going to be made or a sequel is going to be greenlit, they look at the game as a failure because of X, and then they misidentify what X actually was and make choices based on that misidentification. So, for example, in Assassin's Creed Unity, the game faltered because it was rushed out the door to get put out in 2014 in time to capitalize on the next generation console hype because the PS4 and Xbox One had just launched. And so there were tons of technical issues, and that's why the game failed. But corporate executives over at Ubisoft seemed to have the impression that the game failed because, one, it had a historical location that was recreated very, very well. Two, because it played in the same vein as previous Assassin's Creed games and had mostly stealth missions associated with it. And three, because it had a really robust and impressive free climbing system that took center stage as opposed to focusing on like a melee combat system or something like that. So they ignored the real problem and instead focused on what wasn't a problem at all and stripped those things that they misidentified out of future releases. And it's just a bummer in every way, shape, and form because most players weren't upset with the free climbing system. They were actually pretty stoked on it. People weren't upset that the game was set in revolutionary Paris. They were upset that the game was broken and rushed out and not given the time to really excel. And this is something you'll notice a lot as you play through Assassin's Creed Unity is all over the place. There are little shadows of what could have been the future of Assassin's Creed with these crazy huge crowds. I mean, look at how many NPCs are on screen right now. Sure, there's pop-in and sure there's issues like that, but this is remarkable. Like, I can't think of another game other than like Days Gone with the zombies where there are this many NPCs on screen walking around, talking, doing their own thing. This is very impressive, and this is almost a decade old. Or the co-op stealth missions, or the phenomenal lighting engine, or any of these other features that really made this game stand out. All of those are fascinating and compelling mechanics and features. But unfortunately, because this game was rushed out the door and the corporate executives didn't want to admit it was their fault the game did badly, we never got to see what a next-gen Assassin's Creed, given time to really excel, would look like. Instead, we got Assassin's Creed Origins and we got Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which take the series in, let's just say, a different direction. So next I want to show you what a main story quest actually looks like in Assassin's Creed Unity, because it's very different from what we have nowadays. In this quest, we are tasked with assassinating Lafreniere, which is relatively straightforward. He's going to be in this particular area you see right beneath me or under me, and we have a couple of key objectives and important information. We have 4 entrances in this portion of the map, 42 guards to deal with, 4 alarm bells, and 5 hiding spots. So think of that as the briefing we get for this mission. We're told what we're dealing with, where he's going to be, and how we should generally approach it. You can see there's an entrance. We have the alarm bells over here, which they can use to alert other people to come in and basically serve as backup. So if we wanted to do this by the book, we would go take out the alarm bells, then one by one stealth our way into these hordes, and then work our way down underground where we're going to find Lafreniere and we can assassinate him. But remember I said that the game was sort of pay to win? Well, to demonstrate this point, I wanted to show you guys pretty clearly what this is like. And so I bought for like $2, I think it was, this sword I have on my side, which is extremely powerful. Allow me to demonstrate what should be a pretty comprehensive, oh God, did you see that? That wasn't scripted, that was real. What should be a pretty tough combat encounter actually ends up being extremely easy with this weapon. Like, a little stupid easy. Look how quickly I took them out. That's just not even okay. So I guess true to their word, it is factual that paying allows you to skip a lot of things and save time. So what should have been like a 5 to 10 minute escapade and careful consideration of tactics and angles, I just forced my way through with a weapon that is extremely overpowered because I ponied up some cash, and that just sucks. Boom, 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 quick little assassination, wacky with my stick, and then boom. Got you guys, you're good. You're welcome. I also can't help but notice that these skulls are like way disproportionate. Like, look how big that skull is. That's for like Gigantopithecus, not a human being. Good God. Okay, so I'm just gonna go around, knock out these alarm bells, and then I'm gonna hide in a hay bale for him to arrive, and we'll be good. I totally didn't misunderstand the mission at the start. I think I needed to just storm into the underground section. I totally knew what was going on, so yeah. And this is funny. So they don't actually really consider a lot of the broader narrative consequences for your actions. So for example here, it doesn't really make sense that I kill all of these people and then nothing happens. It doesn't make sense. Like, something should happen because I massacred all these people. You would think that this guy I'm going after wouldn't want to come because of it. But instead, all of these people die, and guess what? He's just gonna show up like normal, and it's not gonna be a problem at all. The combat system is also pretty antiquated. It's just sort of like glorified button mashing, and that's about it. It really is not very compelling. It's what's known as a paired animation system, which means that you pair up animations for finisher moves and attack and defense animations. And that's about it, which basically just boils down to smash X for attack and then B for parry, and then occasionally you can break somebody's defense with A, but that's like the whole thing. That's the whole system. That's it. Okay, so now I'm gonna wait in the hay bale and we're gonna assassinate somebody. Why not? But I mean, just look at the quality of the lighting. It's tremendous, especially 2014. The subsurface scattering on their faces and with the skin. It's out of this world for 2014. Come on. I mean, granted, the rest of the game didn't work or look very good, but the skin, oh, baby. And then we are into the body of the mission where we are going to assassinate Lafreniere. And this is your typical main story mission. It's stealth-based. It has dedicated set pieces, narrative justification. Pretty different from nowadays. Boom, just like that. Little hopscotch and a beat away. Taken out. The cutscene plays. Two bros hanging. The costumes were always tremendous in these games, weren't they? I love the costume design. True. True. Remember your place, bro.
Patryk, siema. Dzięki za followka, siemanko.
Yeah, you'll also notice that pretty much everybody has a British accent, even though they're all supposed to be French. It's sort of like the Hollywoodification of Assassin's Creed. It doesn't make sense, but it's what we're doing, so we're just gonna go along with it, you know? So we did it, so now we just escape, and you notice that all throughout these buildings, there are cutouts of little set pieces. So you can see inside, you can see the people walking around in their apartments. We can climb into the window and just hang out in here. Or we can push on through the other side of the window and continue on our escape. Just like here, we can run through. It's pretty cool. If I had to put my experience going back to this game into one word, I would say it feels generally a little surreal, because it has a lot of pieces of core Assassin's Creed, let's say, fanfare that
Halo, Patryk, jesteś tam? Halo, halo.
I mean, people want so much of what this game had to offer, but they haven't gotten it because it's all been stripped out of the series. And yet, even though it has so many of the things that I want in an Assassin's Creed game, it's also lacking a lot of other things and improvements that the other games have made, such as a more robust and, let's say, sturdy engine that doesn't like seem as though it's hanging together by threads. And almost everywhere you look, there's something this game does really well and far better than the current modern versions of these games. And then paired with it is something that it does far, far worse. The free running system, way better in Unity than anything that's released in the last 5 years. Yet, the combat system is pretty atrocious and definitely would not hold up today. The lighting engine is great. It really does look tremendous, even in 2022, I would insist. And yet it's paired with all these other graphical issues and bugs of extreme pop-in. You see the characters, their shadows are popping in just as the camera pans. Like, you can't write this stuff. I couldn't script this if I wanted to. The historical setting is extremely compelling, and I happen to really, really like these games being set on real, verifiable, quantifiable historical events. I just find it really interesting. And yet paired with that is brain-dead AI that makes it so it's really hard to take any of it that seriously. I mean, right here, they have public executions going on, where they have a guillotine set up, they roll the guy down, and you'll see when the blade drops, his head rolls into the basket, and they throw his body into that crate right there. Just watch, here we go. Sorry, dude. Plop. He's gone. The audience is watching, but they don't seem to really be that compelled. They're not cheering or booing or anything. They're just standing there doing nothing, and then they roll the body, which is, to their credit, missing a head now. Throw it in the basket, and it's gone. And you see all of the people cheering in the wrong direction. Their animations don't match what's going on. They aren't facing the right way. It's just, all told, really, really weird. In a lot of ways, it's superficially very beautiful, very interesting, and well put together. But when you start to look with any amount of specificity, it stops being impressive. And it starts to betray a shallowness that's really not. Like here, I just wandered in through the window, and I'm now in these guys' apartment, stepping on their beds, looking at them at their dining table. And they aren't saying anything, they're not doing anything, they're just sitting there, doing nothing. It doesn't make sense, and that makes it so you can't take the world as seriously. And this is why I've said for a long time, I think these games could really benefit from an overhaul to the AI. I mean, every generation we see developers putting a lot more effort into the graphics, into the animation systems, into, let's say, the online system to make it so you can play with more friends at a time, or any number of other improvements that are very immediately apparent and visible. But I think the next generation of games really should target artificial intelligence, because if you can nail the design of a city like this, and then put in intelligent, believable NPCs, that world is worth exploring for its own sake. That world is compelling, and that is a world that I want to explore. And I really think you would not have to put anywhere near as much effort into filling your map with all sorts of little points of interest like they have done here, but instead, just like with Red Dead Redemption 2, you could just build a compelling world and fill it with compelling characters and let that do the heavy lifting for you. If this recreation of France was built out with characters that are living, breathing, have their own schedules, like we saw with Watch Dogs Legion, who do their own thing, have their own motivations, remember you and your actions, that alone would make it worth exploring and would be captivating. I wouldn't need much more than that. And I think that's generally the lesson that's to be learned from most Ubisoft titles of this era. And that is that they were superficially very impressive, both technologically and then also in terms of setting and design. But when you start to apply any pressure or weight onto them, they buckle under the pressure because they aren't built in a robust way. They're built to look good during a trailer or presentation. That's about it. But then you compare it to something like Red Dead Redemption 2, which is built very, very well and very compelling. It doesn't show really well in a trailer because it's built in a very realistic way, but when you're playing it, it feels like you're escaping to another reality. And that's why people have played it for 4 years now and still find it to be one of the best games ever made. But you know what? We've been playing Assassin's Creed Unity for a couple of hours now. For you, it's probably just been a few minutes. But I want to look at this in a broader view and try to get some overarching thoughts in here to wrap this up. So what do we think of Assassin's Creed Unity after going back to it 8 years after its initial launch? Well, I can say that I do find the world design incredibly compelling and impressive. I mean, their recreations of this city, it's nothing short of impressive. I mean, come on. But there are plenty of issues, both graphically, technologically, that still hinder this game even now. You can see the pop-in even during this synchronization for this fast travel point. It's still pretty rough. Yes, it's way better than it was at launch. I've said that before. It's still playable, I think, but it's still pretty rough. But more than anything, it really makes me just ponder what could have been. If this game had done well, had not launched in a broken state, and players had gotten to experience it in its full glory, I think it would have been received very well. Probably would have even been a contender for Game of the Year in 2014, going up against Dragon Age Inquisition. And if that had happened, I can only imagine what the next generation of Assassin's Creed games would have looked like. Like, what would it Origins, Odyssey, and Valhalla have been if this was the game they were trying to base them off of instead of a redesign focused on The Witcher 3? It would have been very interesting to see how that turned out, because what inevitably happened is Unity flopped and failed, Syndicate did okay, but they were looking for a way to reinvent the franchise, and they saw that a lot of people really liked this game called The Witcher 3, which launched in May of 2015, and they said, ooh, maybe we just do that.
Renata,
Hoods and
chodź
stuff.
tutaj.
And that's what they did. And so we got this last trilogy of games, which were fine and interesting in their own right, but they culminated in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which is the embodiment of pretty much everything that die-hard, old-school Assassin's Creed fans hate. When you think about it for
Siadaj.
just a few minutes, it makes you really kind of depressed.
No ja ci sprawdzę, a
Then
ty
you go
tutaj
back
masz
to play
zarób
Unity
trochę na siebie.
You realize that
Chcesz
this
jechać
is the
z
game
Bordeaux do Toulouse, do La
that
Rochelle.
screwed everything up.
No to jest 33
And it is still rough
minuty.
around the edges, but you can play it and enjoy it. And I still think it is
No,
very
Toulouse jest
worthwhile. I
tu.
mean, obviously,
To jest
jumping
dosyć
in now, I
blisko.
can't really give the game a lot of justice. That's not really what this
A
video
to
is
jest
for.
do
But I will say,
Fasola
I
do La
think
Rochelle, a
Unity
tu
as
guma
a
naturalna.
game is worth playing
Rochelle
in
jest kilka.
2022. It's worth trying.
Do
I'm not going
Bayony
to lie to
tu
you and
będzie
tell you it's
dzisiaj.
going to be a great experience or that it's going to be
Targami się
highly polished, because it won't be. But if you are a fan of those old Assassin's Creed games and you want to have another one of those to scratch the itch,
Jeszcze tylko
this is a great
załaduję.
option. It's way better than it was
Wiesz,
at launch. Not perfect, but way better. But who knows? Maybe Ubisoft will surprise us and we'll get another Assassin's Creed focused on Basim, which kind of returns this franchise to its roots
A to z
and
tego
lets
samego
us
miejsca.
see a historical recreation of a city once again, with stealth being the focus. Who knows? People have rumored that that's what's coming next before Assassin's Creed Infinity. I haven't heard anything confirming either which way, so I'm just sitting patiently, hoping that whatever comes
No
next
masz jaja, co tam
is
chcę
more
pobawić
in
się, a ty
line
masz
with
tu
these
jeść.
old school games and less in line with Valhalla, which gave me an 8.
Mama muszę
But let me know what you think of
zrobić.
Unity and the Assassin's Creed
Tak,
franchise
zaraz
in
jak
general
skończysz,
down
to
in the
mam.
comment
Chciałeś
section below the
przyjechać
like
się
button. I do want to hear what you think of it. I know people that work at Ubisoft and work on these Assassin's Creed games actually watch my videos. So who knows? If you leave that comment, somebody over at Ubisoft Montreal or any of their other studios.
Dobra. Więc tak, R2 gaz, tym hamulec, do tyłu, tym do przodu, tym do tyłu, tym skręcasz, tutaj kamera już sobie zrobiła, kółkiem wyrównujesz. Jak będziesz jechać, to chyba kątem się ten robi, pomad włącza na danym momencie, jak jest w gazie. Jak kiedy jedziesz, no to naciśniesz, to będziesz jechać ten płatek. Tu masz dużą mapę, a tu już masz małą mapę, już wbudowaną w samochód. Tu jeszcze ci będzie pokazywać ograniczenie prędkości, jakbyś to przetrwała. Światła raczej nie gdzieś poczuła, które jest 19. Światła. O to chodzi. Mało mapy.
Co?
Mało mapy widzisz. Jakby ktoś tu pisał, to odpowiem.
Na pewno.
W ogóle.
Bo wyjechać to? Tutaj muszę to zawiązać,
Jako prawe, tu lewe, nie?
ale nie widzę co się dzieje tam.
Możesz ewentualnie górny buty sobie.
O, które to był?
I z powrotem wracać. Wracasz w te miejsca, to się kamerę zmieni.
Aha. Miałam sprawdzić? Nie. Kurde, to jest straszne. To trzeba jeszcze sprawdzać, czy coś jedzie.
No,
No wiem właśnie, ale
no.
no to tak ciężko.
Zaraz.
Co?
Ten gry jest wyciekany.
Nie wiem, o czym ty mówisz.
Proszę powiedzieć.
O, tylko trochę. Jak to dźwięk gry wyciszony? Jak ja
Jak
wszystko...
naciśnij na ten, to nie wiem.
Które to się robiło? Ale które to się robiło? Kwadrata? Ale teraz trzeba wyłączyć go. Ja przecież słyszałam wszystko. Teraz to ja ciebie nie słyszę.
Pokrzyczysz!
Płaciłam manę. Co? Nie zdążyłam z 80 na 50 wejść. Rękoskazów się nie włącza, prawda? To zdjęcie wysyłasz. Tak. Się tak włącza. Nie, jeszcze nie dostałam. czy tutaj na tych muszę coś robić? Na szlabanie? Damian! Czym zapłacić na bramkach? Co to jest? Ja nie wiem, który to enter.
Gdzie mam tu jechać?
No dojechałam. A ja tu szukałam.
Jak tam się zrobić? Jedź w prawo. Mocno w prawo.
Gdzie mocno w prawo?
Czekaj.
A, że tam, to cofnąć trzeba.
No co? Do której mamy tu dalej? Gdzieś się...
Bo i ewentualnie też tankowanie jest, prawda?
O, to jest...
No. O, to nie jest.
Towar mamy dowieźć do 15:05, to jest 8.
Co teraz? Już?
Nie wiem, czy światło jak będzie światło.
No to coś.
Bajon. To daleko. Telefon.
Nie, teraz. Nie, wcześniej nie słucham.
Jest. O. Niestety.
Dobra. No. Nie zrobiłam. 400. I wcześniej zapętlę. Nie pamiętam. Nie znam. Tak, świetnie. Gratulacje. Sądzę, że tak jeden to może nie będzie dobrze.
Bajon. Pan skończył Poczekaj,
Dlaczego?
Przerwij teraz. Dobra.
No dajmy, no to nie mów mi, że jest prosto.
Ale za wcześnie? Będę coś takiego
No bo teraz nie mogę co.
Tak, samochód będzie.
Sorry, ja. O kurwa, zahaczyłam.
Gdzie? Zobacz.
Powinnam tu zacząć wjeżdżać, nie?
Nie wiesz?
No. No wiem, to się jakbym jechała normalnie samochodem. Jakbym jechała normalnie samochodem, to bym zrobiła. I co teraz?
No jeszcze można sobie parkować. No zarobiłeś 7 koła, więc chyba te mandaty.